Hi, I'm Katie, and this is my tutorial for a magnetic pinkeep finish as seen on the Spring Tiny Treasures Kit Stacy Nash Primitives Feathered Nest Pin Book. This tutorial does have a proper introduction, which you're going to see in just a minute, but I wanted to tell you that in editing the video together, I have noticed that there are some focus issues in the first segments of the tutorial. Thankfully, not where it's really problematic. I did clear that up, and you do have pretty clear video in the places where you'll need it. However, please be patient with me during the early going of this tutorial. The video is not as clear as it should be, but it does resolve, and you will have all the instruction that you need to do this beautiful finish. Hi, I'm Katie, and this is my tutorial on finishing a pin book with ribbon and a magnetic interior with a contrast lining so that it can hold little pins or needle threaders or anything small and magnetic. This is my already finished Stacy Nash piece that I made for my mom, that I Will Cut You pin book. But today I will be finishing the Spring Tiny Treasures Kit, which is the Feathered Nest pin book with lining, ribbon, magnets, and all that good stuff. So what do you need to do this finish? You will need cardstock or bristol cut to template to line with your chosen fabric. You'll need mat board for your exterior pieces that you're going to cover with linen. You'll also need felt to pad that with to get these really nice rounded shapes that I've got on my example here. You will also need Mistyfuse, which is a double-sided fusible web, very fine, that you can use to bond. I'll explain more about that in a minute. You'll need your lining fabric. You'll also need very strong magnets. So Needle in a Haystack sells rare earth magnets in sizes suitable for use in needlework. They do also come in larger sizes. I'll share everything that I'm using here in the description with links. You're going to need tacky glue to attach your felt to your mat board. You'll need your stitch piece. You'll need your ribbon. I have 27 inches here that I have cut into two 10.5-inch lengths for the ties, and then I've got a 6-inch length that I'm going to cut apart to make the hinges. You'll need silk or cotton thread for your finishing. I'm using surfine and kinkame sewing thread, and I'll share all the details on those in the description. You will need fine pins, and then you'll also need your fine finishing needles. Today I'm going to be using a number 10 milliner's needle and a curved beading needle. So regarding the kits, these have not yet been released at the time of filming. All details are in the description. What's included are those items that are specific to the Feathered Nest finish. That would be your Liberty London lawn to line it with, the coordinating ribbon, and then the little crystal bead for the bird's eye. Things that are just kind of standard finishing supplies I have not included. You'll need to get those themselves. So we'll start today with the finishing. I've done a lot of the prep work already, and I'll go into what I've done, but at this point my piece itself has been fully blocked. It's been prepared for finishing, and then after I blocked it and it was totally ready to go, I stitched on the little crystal for the bird's eye. So you always want to do that last. For a pillow finish, I will normally use a fusible interfacing, but here, because I want this to have some flex as I work it over the oval, there's no interfacing used. This is just linen. Oh, also included in the feathered nest kits are a template. So this is made from cardstock, and there are 2 of them, so that you can just cut these out and use them as your interior ovals for your lining. To get a really smooth edge and finish, I like to make my mat board, so those are my exterior rounds, just a little bit larger than my interior ones. So what I've done here is I've used the cardstock template that's provided with the kit. I've cut just inside that line, and then I've used the cut piece for my template on the mat board. I drew around it and I tried to cut just outside the line. It's a very, very slight little touch, but it can help improve your finish. And then the other preparatory steps you need to take with your mat board, as I said, mine has already been fully prepared, is cut your felt and glue it and let dry. I have cut mine a little smaller so you get that rounded edge. Sorry, I think I said that already. And then on the piece that I'm going to use here with the front, this is just plain front and back. But on the piece that I'm using for the bottom piece, I have drilled in 3 holes, as this is a 1/8 by 1/16 inch, and the 1/8 is the width of the magnet. I chose a 1/8 inch drill bit and then just drilled 3 holes, and then you can just pop those magnets right in, and they'll hold because they've got the felt behind them. That actually I'm going to need to widen just a little bit with an awl. So just make sure that your drilled holes are large enough. And they don't always want to go in quite neatly, so you just have to keep at it. Okay, so now I have inserted my magnets. I don't actually need to glue them at all because they'll be held in place by the lining eventually. So that's fully ready. And I'm going to set each of these with the piece that I want them to go with. And so I've glued the felt to the mat board and let it dry. I have inserted my magnets into my bottom piece. So those are all completely ready. And then the next thing I have to do is prep my interior lining. So I have cut the Mistyfuse a little smaller than the oval so that it won't shift at all and get exposed beyond it when I go to bond this. So to do that, you just press this with an iron, follow the directions on the package. So I'm going to lay my fabric over this, bond this off camera, and then come back, clip, and lace this ready for finishing. You can, of course, cut a piece of Mistyfuse that's the size of your lining, clip, and then bond it down around the edges, but I don't like to do that because the Mistyfuse essentially turns to glue. That gives you a hard edge here at your turn where you're trying to take your needle through to stitch the whole thing together. So even though it's more trouble to clip and lace the lining, I actually find that it makes for much easier stitching once you're actually putting the whole piece together. So that's why I'm going to do that. But of course you can, do it the other way if that appeals to you more. One other note on ribbon. So I'm using a very fine single face silk ribbon, 1/4 inch width. I bought these at wholesale for the kits, but another great option, and what I used here on the I Will Cut You pinkeep, is from River Silks. These are carried by Needle in a Haystack. They come in a wide number of colors, and I used the 7mm width. All details on the finish for I Will Cut You, what I used, and the extras are in a previous floss tube, and I will link all of that in the description. You know, whether you're finishing Feathered Nest from the kit, from your own stash, or you're using this method to finish a totally different piece. So what I'm going to do now is bond my lawn to my lining pieces, and then I will come back and show you how I prepare them. Okay, so I have now bonded both pieces with the fusible web. You can see what that looks like. There's a little gap here because the Mistyfuse didn't go all the way to the edge. This is what it looks like after it's just been ironed. And then on one of these, I've already cut it down, and then I've clipped all of these things ready for lacing. Now, one thing I realized I didn't address is you might be wondering, why did I bother to bond this if I'm just going to turn and lace it? It's because the lawn is very, very fine and the cardstock isn't thin enough to pin in place. So the Mistyfuse just keeps this from slipping while I am lacing this together. Now to lace, I am going to use Kinkame silk thread. I will link this in the description. You can, of course, use any kind of cotton sewing thread or a lacing thread that you like. This isn't particularly important. I just really like it. It's strong. It makes the finishing more pleasant. And then here I'm going to use a number 10 milliner's needle. And, you know, I just figure, why not use something nice if it makes your day a little better and you already have it. But it's certainly not essential at all. So I will put all the details on the exact threads that I've used. But if cotton sewing thread is what you have and what's readily available to you, go ahead and use it. There's nothing wrong with it. I think you'll find that adding silk thread to your finishing can just make the job more pleasant, but it's really not essential. So I'm just gonna lace this thing together. I'm going across the shape of the oval. I'm picking up each little flap that I've cut and clip aggressively because that will just help this be neater. And then when I take my needle through each, put my thumb down on it to hold it in place because it's too hard to maintain constant tension on the thread. There's just too much of it. You also don't want to pull too tight. It'll cause cardstock to warp. It's not actually that thick. This isn't mat board. And oh no, I should be going in this direction. I'm too busy talking. I don't even know what I'm doing. Dear Lord. This tutorial might be cursed. I hope it ends up making sense in the end. So I'm just gonna rethread my thread, and I think I'm supposed to be going in this direction, or I don't know, maybe I'm gonna watch this back and I had it right all along and it's just all kinds of messed up. So picking that up, and I'm going around to lace this. So I'm going to finish this job off camera because it's really not interesting. I'll do both of these and then come back and show you the next step. Okay, so now I have completed lacing my interior pieces. You can see that I have just done that in a sunray pattern. Sorry, it's been a while since I've filmed overhead, so I'm struggling with this. And those are now ready for me to use. I'm going to set them aside, and we're going to essentially repeat the same process with the linen with a couple key differences. So I'm just going to cut this down just a little to start with into a rough oval shape, and then I will cut and trim it more after it's been pinned in place, just to get some of that bulk out of there. Okay. So the most important thing here is positioning. You want to make sure to get this on exactly the way you want it to appear, and that can take some adjustment. So what I like to do is pin north, south, east, and west. See how that goes, and then adjust as necessary. It frequently does take a lot of fiddling to get something to land exactly the way you'd like. So yeah, see, I'd like that to be a little further down. So I'm gonna put my north pin in, take those two out, move this down. And then, yeah, that's much better. Oh, I actually did something right on camera. You know, it's so funny finishing. You can do something right 100 times off camera, and then it seems the minute you turn on record, you just struggle to do everything. So that gives me the general parameters, and then I'm going to put in a few right here on the well, not the corners, on the curves. Oh, okay, see, that's not quite right, so I need to adjust this again. Oh, yeah, pride cometh before a fall. It's just oh, I did this right, and nope, need to adjust a little. This is the reality of finishing, people. Try again, and then just keep moving stuff around. That's also why I don't clip too closely at first, because, and now I've gone too far. Yeah, maybe I'll just put that one in first. Since that's what's giving me trouble. Then my pin at the top. Check the sides. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So I'll put in more pins once I've clipped this. This is just to make sure that I've got this correctly positioned on the form before I go and cut this thing down, because once you've cut, there's no going back. So if I had found, you know, that my strawberry was too far over and then I had cut this thing first, there would have been no changing that. So check again before you go and cut anything. Okay, so I've got the general positioning marked out here. I'm happy with that placement. You know, you can obviously adjust this as much as you want, and then from there I'm going to just cut this down roughly into an oval shape. And I just eyeball this, but if you have trouble with that, you can also use a ceramic pencil and a ruler and mark out well, essentially seam allowance around it. So then before I go and clip my curves, I'm gonna finish the rest of my pinning just so that I've got everything really accurately marked. So I like to put in a lot of pins, especially for something like a round or an oval shape where you're clipping pretty close to the edge. You just need to know where to stop. The pins will really help you with that. So I'm gonna put this and keep on going. And I will knock plenty of these out when I'm doing my finishing, because the more pins you've got in, the harder it is to keep them clear of your lacing with that really long thread. But this is really important during this process. So what usually happens is I put in 1,000,000 pins when I'm doing the mounting process. Half of them end up on the floor while I'm lacing, and then I spend forever picking them up after I'm done. Thankfully, you'll get to miss that process, but that's why I do what I do. And the reason I use mat board for anything stitched is essentially so I can do this. The pinning allows me, and you need the mat board for something to sink the pins into. Cardstock doesn't give you enough of an edge. And then this allows me to be really exact with my positioning. And then I do leave these in when I'm lacing so that nothing shifts. Even though, yeah, as I mentioned, that does make the lacing a little more complicated. But I'll tell you what I do to try and help with that once I get to that process. So I'm almost done pinning this, and then I can go ahead and start clipping. You can just adjust anything as necessary while you're pinning. And so at this point, I've cut it down, but I haven't yet clipped, which means if there was anything I was unsatisfied with in the positioning, it's not too late to change. When I flip this over and I start clipping, it's too late to change. So I take my pinky and I roll that up to the edge of the mat board so that I don't go too far with my clipping, because you want a pretty deep cut so that you get a clean edge around those curves, but too deep and it'll show. You don't want little raggedy linen bits at the edge of your nicely finished oval. So once I kind of establish how deep I'm going, and from there I just eyeball. And as you can see, I clip pretty aggressively to get around these curves. That's always worked for me, but you know, I'm sure many of you have your own methods, ways you like to do things, and that's totally fine. This is just showing one way that I do things, and it's not necessarily correct. I also like to give a shout out here to Lana Pfeiffer. So her tutorial on finishing round ornaments was really what taught me how to finish anything round, oval, or otherwise, which I had really struggled with before. I'll link her relevant tutorials in the description. They are excellent if you haven't watched them. And I strongly recommend her as a teacher for anything on finishing. As you can see, I've kind of thrown in my own little twists and adaptations to make it suit how I like to work. But, you know, she really taught me the basics here. Okay, so that's now fully been clipped. Made a nice mess on my table too. And I'm going to start the lacing process, which is exactly the same as it is with the lining, only, as I said, I leave the pins in while I'm working. So trying to work around them is actually the most difficult part here. So I'm gonna start this on camera just so you can watch. But what I actually do is, so I've got this horrifically long lacing thread here and all these pins that I'm trying to keep clear of my horrifically long lacing thread. So when I'm doing this, not for a tutorial, I stand and I let the thread dangle down underneath. I hold the piece up in the air like this. Sorry, I almost whacked the camera. And then I let the lacing thread hang loose underneath. So that helps keep it clear of the pins. I invariably still catch some and pull them loose, but that helps because I like to leave the pins in. It really keeps things from shifting while you're lacing, but you do have this problem of, you know, that long thread just wants to catch all those pins. So I'm going around in a sunray fashion as I did with the lining. I put my thumb down to hold the previous one in place because again, I want to get this tight but not too tight, and that helps me. And I'm trying to pull this through without catching all my pins, and then keeping my little clips clear so that the next one's available for me to lace. So I'm going to repeat this around the whole. See, that's what happens. It wants to just kind of go in and out of all those pins. This is the most difficult thing if you're going to leave your pins in while you're lacing, so that I don't start turning the air blue on camera. I'm going to pause this and I'm going to finish the rest of the lacing here in my standard positioning of standing and letting the thread hang free. I'll come back to you when that's done. Okay, I just have to crow for a minute because I have now finished the lacing, both front and back. Look at all of those pins that are still attached to this piece. I can't believe it. They always just fall out like crazy. So normally what I do after I've finished lacing is I pull whatever pins are remaining in my piece, and then I pull and then I go and search for the rest of the ones that have fallen on the floor. But fortune smiled on me today. The back looks pretty straight on. Of course, now that I'm looking at the front, that's really supposed to be, that stem's supposed to be pointing straight up and down, and I've kind of got that skewed a little bit, but you know, I think that looks pretty good. I'm pretty satisfied, even if it's not exactly like the picture. And then if I flip this over and I lay the lining piece over that, it pretty much obscures all of my clips, which means I'm going to get a really nice smooth finish here. So I am going to stitch the lining to the linen on both of these pieces. Might have to test fit that a little bit. These turned out a little, okay. Anyways, sorry, thinking out loud on camera, not very helpful. But the first thing that I want to do here is attach my ribbon ties. So you need to, because the ribbon is sandwiched in between the lining and the linen piece, that needs to go on first. So I'm going to put this halfway ish, and then pin that in place and then stitch it in. So one thing that's really important is if you're using a similar kind of very thin silk ribbon, you want to get a little tail in here because this does have the tendency to shred. And then I'm going to check and make sure that that looks good from the front. Yes, it does. So you want to give this just a little room in here so it can't unravel right at the end and come apart. You do have to watch this stuff a little bit. It's beautiful. It makes for these nice drapey bows and lovely finishes, but it has its weak spots. It's thin, that's why it's so drapey, and you just have to account for that in your finishing. So up until now, I've been using the kinkame for all of my lacing because it's really strong and it doesn't snag. However, for the rest of my finishing, I'm switching to Swasser Fien. The color is 2142. It's a really good match to Fuller's Teasel, so my stitches are just going to disappear right into the linen. It's really nice. I'm just going to start here with knots because why not? And I'm going to go ahead and stitch this to the linen, taking several tacking stitches. Now, once I've got that first one in, I'm going to take out this pin so that it doesn't get in my way. And just try and keep that as straight to the edge as possible. You may want to switch to a curved needle at this point. Anytime you've got a hard edge, the curved needle can be easier to work with than the milliners. I seem to be, sorry, trying to keep all this on camera. I seem to be doing okay with the milliners here, so I'm going to keep going with it. And I'm just going to try and get this secure here. So I will go back through the ribbon tie again right at the edge when I go and stitch the lining to the linen. So this isn't my only attachment. I just want to get it in position and secure so that if I tug at it, it's not going anywhere. Just going to finish with a couple running stitches. Pull that through. Clip. And then I'm going to repeat for the back, only for that when I position it. I'm going to lay these two on top of each other and then pin in place according to the positioning here so that these meet up perfectly. Okay, so at this point I've attached my ties front and back. If I lay the pieces over each other, they're meeting up really well. And now I put in the hinges. So I like to do 2 ribbon hinges at the top edge, kind of around, hugging the slight curve of the oval, because that reduces the stress on any one hinge. If you're doing this with a stronger ribbon, say a double face satin, that won't be necessary. You can just use 1 ribbon hinge, but for something really thin like this single face silk, I think putting 2 in reduces the stress. So you go slightly off center. I've taken my 6-inch length and I have cut it in half, giving me 3 inches each, and that's a little more than I'll need, but I think, again, you want to have extra length extending into the piece to just take the stress off the attachment points here. So I'm going to pin that in place a little off center. And then do you also see how I'm angling this? Because you're going to want it to, well, it can't fold because of the pin, but you're going to want it to fold nicely around the curve of the piece. So that one about there. That shows you where you should have your positioning. Now I've pinned both of these and I'm going to stitch them in place just like I did with my side ties. As you can see, my stitching there is not pretty at all. It's strictly functional, a very quick and dirty job, and it's going to be the same right here. The hinges are now in place on the front, and now we're going to come to kind of the most fiddly part of this. You want to just fold these and finger press them into place just above the edge of the linen, as you can see there, and then I'll position these one by one and stitch them into place. You want to get the angle right so it doesn't show too much at the edge, but so that the hinge has enough room to move. So the way I'm going to do that is I've got this, I'm holding it in place with my finger, lay the back on top, Make sure that I'm lined up here so your ties are kind of what help you navigate this, and then you just nudge it in place until it looks right. So that's good. I can see just a little bit at the edge here. It's not a big loop, but that hinge will have some room to move. I might poke that down just a little bit more. I'm gonna use a pin to kind of maneuver that into place. And then I'm going to take the pin right through this edge and sink it. I'm going to try to. This is harder than it sounds. Into this back piece. So I've now pinned that in place. Now where my hinge location is. Test that. So if I look from the front, I haven't done a great job of pinning that. I think I might just eyeball this. Okay, see, and this is why you have to be careful with this ribbon. It does damage quite easily and it has a distinct tendency to shred. So I'm gonna fold those over there. Line up. And yeah, so I'm using my finger to hold those together. Sorry, it's been a while since I did this, and the last time was not on camera. So I'm gonna try stitching that in place and then see how it looks. And as you can see, I've got way too much length in the middle here, but I'm gonna only trim that after I know I've got my positioning correct and I'm definitely done. Because once you've cut things, you can't take that back. And if I need to change anything, I'm gonna wanna have that length. So I'm taking just a couple stitches here. And then if I fold those back over, how does that look? Okay. Okay, so I know that my first hinge is correct, and I'm gonna go ahead and sew that down. The second one will be easier because you've got the general length between the two sides established. I'm just going to take a few more tacking stitches, and because these go right next to each other, you can use the same length of thread for both. All right, that should be good enough for now because, as I said, I will come back over the ribbon and pick it up with the tacking stitches when I go to stitch the lining in. Sorry, I dropped my needle and I'm trying to rethread it. Okay, so then this, I wanted an angle. So I folded that back in place. Put that on top of it and then try and just, you know, yeah, this is more fiddly than I remember. I'm just going to guess based on the approximate positioning of my other hinge, and that's going to be good enough. I try to be a reasonably detailed finisher, but I'm not a professional one, and I'm not a perfect finisher by any means. Also gets boring, honestly. At this point, you just kind of want the job to be done. Oh, and I've gone and slipped my thread again. Can you see what I'm talking about here? I'm starting to get impatient, so I'm just like, I'm done fitting the second hinge. Hold that there with my finger, and then this time, try and stitch it in. Okay, so now that I've got those first couple stitches in, I'm gonna fold this over and see how it looks from the top. Pretty good. That's not the neatest job I've ever done. I did a little better with I Will Cut You. If you also notice on I Will Cut You, I also spaced those a little further apart, and I think that probably helped. So that's a little under 1/2 inch apart, and I would actually recommend doing that as opposed to the closer hinges that I've got here. But let me just pull that in a little bit so that it's not too loose. I'm gonna go ahead and finish stitching this down. Okay, the number of times I have now pulled my needle out of my thread convinces me that I should do this off camera and that I'll return to you once that is stitched down. Okay, so that's together. I've clipped a little extra that was extending into the middle, and then if I close these, line everything up, it looks pretty good. It's not the neatest job I've ever done, but it's pretty. So the last thing to do, good news, we're reaching the end here, is to go ahead and stitch in the lining pieces. So because I cut these by hand, they're not perfect. So I'm just going to try and look at this to see which positioning matches up best with the edges I've got it, and that's definitely the orientation I want there. So I'm gonna go ahead and start my thread by slipping through to the edge with a number 10 millimeters needle. And I'm using the Swasserfine, a nice long length, so that I can get all the way along around the edge of this without having to change my thread. And now that I've started it, I am going to move to a curved beading needle, and I will put sources for everything that I've used in the description for this tutorial. So important thing here is that you want to keep this in the right position. So I'm going to hold this, the bulk of this in place as I stitch, and I'm going to just slip stitch this together. So I'm taking my needle down, why can't I get it under the camera? Okay, so I've taken my needle down and then picked up a little bit of linen. I'm coming back up. I'm staying a little bit inside the edge because that's where it's going to meet the slightly smaller lining piece. And then I do the same thing here. I pick up just a little bit of that edge. I come back out and I draw those down close together, or I would if I hadn't just put a knot in my thread. That's called slip stitching. So I'm going to slip stitch this together all the way around this edge. So watch where you're putting your needle when you come down in your linen. You want it to roughly meet up with the edge of where your lining is going to sit so that you get the cleanest possible edge. And then the smaller you keep your stitches in terms of how much you're picking up between them, the closer you will draw it down in and the neater edge you'll get. It's very tempting to take these gigantic stitches and just kind of whip this thing together. But with a curve, you will really benefit from, see, that's a nice small space between stitches, and I'm going to want that because I'm here at the sharpest angle of the curve and really want to pull those down closely together. And this is why I didn't fuse over my edge of the lining here, because you can see, again, I'm trying to keep everything in position by holding it with one hand in position and then stitching with the other. So I didn't Mistyfuse all the way to the edge and then fuse the clipped edges on the back side in place, because then that gives me this nice soft edge. You can see how easily my needle is going through it. I have done this before where I've fused the back into place, and it's like trying to take your needle through, dried glue, essentially. And that's why you do it. You go through a little extra effort with the lacing of this piece, but then it makes your finish, your final finishing, you're stitching all this together right at the end when you are most ready to be done. Much, much easier. Because these curved needles are quite fine, and you can actually break them if you're trying to force it through something where it really doesn't want to go. So that's the slip stitching. You can see it's giving me a nice clean edge there. Or I hope you can. Camera's having some trouble focusing today. So I'm going to continue all the way around this edge, and the same on this back piece, and then I will come back to you to show how I end off the thread and this piece. Okay, I'm not quite at the end here, but I remembered that there was something else I was going to show you. So I have finished stitching in the lining on the top. I've done most of the bottom, but what I was going to show you was the importance of stitching through the ribbon when you reach it. So it's supported in one direction by your tacking stitches, attaching it to the linen, and then you also want to make sure to stitch through it 2 to 3 times when you reach that. Also, make sure you're pulling your stitches tight as you work around so that it all sits really nicely. Okay, so here I am taking my needle up right at the edge of the ribbon, and I want to go through it before I go back down into the linen. So I've just taken my needle straight through the ribbon, got it on the side of my piece, of course. And then I'm going to pick up my slip stitch right beneath that. In linen, and I'm going to just pick up just a couple linen threads so that I'm coming up back through that ribbon. You want to make sure you get through the ribbon at least twice. 3 times is best, just because you want this to be as supported as possible. So again, I'm trying. Flip the ribbon back up so you can see my needles come straight through it, and pull my thread through. Bite into the edge of my lining. Just a super tiny bit. And that way I'll have gotten 3 tacking stitches through this ribbon tie so that it's really well supported. And then I'm going to just pull my needle so you can see right through the edge of that ribbon. Flip it to the back. Pull that all nice, really tight so it sits flush, the lining against the linen. And then I am going to continue working back around to where I started, and then I'll come back and show you how to finish this off. Okay, so I have now slip stitched all the way around both front and back. You can see I've got this lovely smooth edge. I've come back to where I started on this back side, and I just need to secure my thread end. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to go back over my stitches here. I'm going to take some more slip stitches, and here, because my thread's so close to the color of the linen, you can see I just came out here on the side, not where it would meet the lining. So I'm just going to take my thread over a single linen thread and bury it. You don't necessarily need to be, going back over your attachment to the lining. You just need to have extra stitches in there. Call them tacking stitches. And these ensure that your last stitch that is attaching isn't taking all the stress, so it doesn't come loose. I just slipped my needle again. I'm doing that a lot today. I'm gonna rethread. And how many tacking stitches you need is kind of a personal preference thing. I like to take a lot because you've gone to all of this work, why not? So I'm just going to keep going over this a few more times. And you can work, back and forth in multiple directions. It doesn't have to all be one way. So I think that's, about as much as I need. And then I'm going to pull my thread up, and my needle is right there at the side, as you can see. Pull that through. And then I'm just going to clip my thread right at the base so it disappears. So that finishes off the thread. That also finishes off the pinkeep. So if you see, I can now drop some pins in the bottom because it's magnetic, it'll hold them. The magnets are actually strong enough to hold scissors before you put the fabric on top of it. Fabric's not a good conductor, so you can see even though that does have some power, it won't actually hold the scissors in place. So that is my feathered nest pin book finish. Oop. Got the beautiful Liberty Lawn for the interior. I just love this. I think it adds a lot to the finish. There's a lot of pizzazz when you open it up and see that beautiful color. So that's the finish for my magnetic pinkeep. I hope that you've enjoyed it. All materials, threads, etc. used are going to be in the tutorial. The kit for this specific piece is coming very soon. Again, all details are in the description. I'll see you again for my next regularly scheduled floss tube. And until then, happy stitching.